Hello everyone, welcome to Engineer Science YouTube channel, and this is our first lecture of resolution of vector series. In this lecture we will discuss the basic concept of resolution of vector. So let's start the topic. So what basically the resolution of vector is? The resolution of vector is simply the process of breaking up of a vector into its component vector. In resolution vector, we divide a vector, we break a vector, or we can say we split a vector into its component vectors. For example, suppose that you have vector f, and this vector is making a particular angle from positive x-axis. So theta is the standard angle. A standard angle is the angle which is measured in anti-clockwise direction from positive x-axis. So this is positive x-axis and this is positive y-axis. Here you can see a vector f which is making angle theta from positive x-axis. Now how we can resolve this vector? We can resolve this vector by drawing a perpendicular line from the head of the vector, and this line drops on x-axis. This line is perpendicular to x-axis. It starts from the head of the vector and ends on the x-axis. Now similarly, draw a perpendicular line to y-axis. This line starts from the y-axis and ends on the head of the vector, or we can say starts from the head of the vector and ends on y-axis. Now this vertical line which is drawn from the head of the vector to the x-axis is representing the y component of the vector. Since it is parallel to y-axis, so it can easily be remembered that this is the y component of the vector. Now this line which is drawn by joining the head and head of the vector and y-axis is representing the x component of the vector. So in this way we can get the two components of the vector and the vector is set to be resolved. Now we can see that if this line length is fx, then this length should also be fx. So we can write fx here. We can also see that if this length is fy, then this length should also be fy. We can write as fy. Now you can see that the vector is resolved into its two components. The first component is the x component, the second component is the y component. You can draw x component here, or you can draw this component here as well. Both methods and both methodologies are correct. This component which is parallel to y-axis is representing the y component of the vector. You can draw this component here, or you can also draw this component here. Since this component, that is y component, is parallel to y-axis, so that's why this component is also known as y component of the vector. And this component is parallel to x-axis, so this component of the vector is known as x component of the vector. We can see that this component lies horizontally at 0 degree, so we can also say this component a horizontal component. Similarly, you can see that this component of the vector is lying parallel to y-axis, so this component can also be known as vertical component of the vector. In this way, we can resolve a vector which is making angle theta from positive x-axis into its two components. The first component is known as x component, the second component is known as y component. These two components of a vector, this is the vector f, and now it is resolved into its two components. The first component is fy and the second component is fx. Now we can see that these components are perpendicular to each other, so it is a rule of thumb that both components of the vector are always lying at 90 degree from each other. Fx and Fy means the x component of the vector and the y component of the vector are always at 90 degree angle, means they are always perpendicular to each other. So this is the basic concept of resolution of vector. Resolution of vector is nothing, it is just a process of breaking up of a vector, a process of splitting of vector into its component. And in two-dimensional vector analysis, we always have two components of the vector. The first component is the x component, which is also known as the horizontal component, whereas the second component is the y component, which is also known as the vertical component of the vector. Now the point which is necessary to understand here is that now this vector is vanished, this vector is finished, because this vector is now split in two components, which is fx and fy. Now this vector no more longer exists because it is already split into its two components. The first component is the x component, the second component is the y component. So the basic advantage of resolution of vector is that we get the vector into its component form, but the components are along the axes. So by resolving a vector into its component, we get the two components, and the two components are along the axes of the vector. So this is the basic concept of resolution of vector. In coming lectures, we will discuss that how the magnitude of x and y components of the vector can be calculated, and from the magnitudes of x and y component, how we can again get the magnitude and direction of our resultant vector. So we will discuss these concepts in detail in the coming lecture. So keep in touch and keep watching these videos. Thank you.